when 9-year-old Mason Reed walked into the Iron Ridge MC Clubhouse in rural Pennsylvania on a cold November afternoon, carrying a worn leather motorcycle helmet that was 3 sizes too big for him, and said in a voice that barely reached above a whisper that his grandpa's helmet was still hanging on the hook at home, waiting for him to come back, even though everyone kept saying Grandpa wasn't coming back anymore. The room full of weathered bikers went completely silent in the way that only happens when grown men who've seen too much loss recognize the specific weight of a child's grief that hasn't been given permission to exist. What Mason didn't know was that his grandfather, Robert Ironside Reed, had been road captain of the Iron Ridge chapter for 31 years before a heart attack took him 6 months earlier while he was working on his Harley in his garage, and that the brotherhood gathered in that clubhouse had been looking for Robert's family ever since the funeral, trying to find the grandson Ironside had talked about constantly, but whom they'd never met because a bitter divorce had created distance between Robert and his daughter's family that he'd been trying to repair right up until the day he died. The Iron Ridge MC Clubhouse sat at the end of a gravel road outside Harrisburg, a converted barn with motorcycles lined up like sentinels along the front, and the club's colors hanging above the entrance, black and silver patches showing a mountain peak bisected by a road that stretched to the horizon. It was 3:47 in the afternoon on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, and inside the clubhouse, 14 members of Iron Ridge MC were gathered for their monthly meeting, discussing charity rides and maintenance schedules and the usual business of keeping a motorcycle club running through another Pennsylvania winter. The air smelled like coffee and motor oil, and the wood stove that kept the space barely warm enough to be comfortable. Jack "Wrench" Morrison was mid-sentence about replacing the clubhouse roof before snow season when the door opened and everyone turned to look at the kid standing in the doorway. The boy was small for what looked like 9 or 10 years old, wearing a puffy winter coat that was slightly too large, and jeans with grass stains on the knees, and sneakers that had been expensive once but were scuffed now from hard use. His hair was dark brown and needed cutting, falling over his forehead in a way that partially hid eyes that were red-rimmed from recent crying. In his hands he clutched a motorcycle helmet, black with silver striping, the kind of full-face protection that serious riders wore, clearly sized for an adult and obviously old enough that the padding inside had compressed from years of use. The boy stood there in the doorway, letting cold air spill into the room, and looked around at 14 leather-vested bikers with the kind of desperate hope that children show when they're looking for something they're afraid they won't find. His small hands gripped the helmet so tightly his knuckles had gone white, and his breathing was coming in shallow gasps like he'd been running or was trying very hard not to cry or both. Wrench, who was vice president of the chapter and had a grandfather's instinct even though his own grandkids lived 3 states away, stood up slowly and approached the boy with his hands visible and his voice gentle in the way that big men learn to use when they don't want to frighten children. "Hey there, son. You looking for someone? Can we help you?" The boy's eyes swept across the assembled bikers and landed on a wall where photographs hung in mismatched frames, pictures of the club at various rides and events and gatherings, faces that spanned decades of brotherhood. His gaze fixed on one photograph in particular, a group shot from what looked like 5 or 6 years ago, and his face crumpled slightly before he forced it back into control. "My grandpa used to come here." The boy's voice was small but steady, like he'd practiced what he was going to say. His name was Robert Reed. People called him Ironside. He died and nobody will talk about him anymore, and his helmet is still on the hook at home, and Mom says I have to stop asking about him. But I can't stop thinking about him, and I thought maybe someone here would remember him and could tell me about him, because I don't want to forget. The room went absolutely silent. Wrench felt like someone had punched him in the chest. Behind him, he could hear another member's sharp intake of breath and the scrape of a chair as someone stood up abruptly. Robert Ironside Reed had been one of Iron Ridge's founding members, a man who'd ridden with them for over 3 decades, who'd served as road captain and mentor, and the kind of steady presence that held a club together through good times and bad. His death 6 months ago had devastated the entire chapter, and they'd all attended his funeral, a service that had drawn over 200 bikers from clubs across Pennsylvania and neighboring states. But there had been no family at that funeral beyond Robert's elderly sister. The man's daughter, estranged for years over some family conflict Robert had never fully explained, hadn't come. The members had asked about grandchildren, about whether there was anyone else who needed support, but Robert's sister had said the daughter had cut off contact and wanted nothing to do with her father's motorcycle life. The club had tried to reach out anyway, had sent letters and made phone calls, but they'd gotten no response, and eventually they'd assumed that Robert's daughter was dealing with her grief in her own way and didn't want their involvement. Now, here was this boy, this small kid with red-rimmed eyes and his grandfather's helmet clutched in desperate hands, saying that nobody would talk about Robert anymore, that he'd been told to stop asking, that he was trying not to forget. Wrench knelt down to the boy's level, his own eyes burning. "Son, what's your name?" "Mason. Mason Reed. My grandpa was Robert Reed, and he used to ride motorcycles, and he was going to teach me how when I got older, but he died before he could. And now everyone acts like he never existed, but he did exist, and he was the best grandpa, and I miss him so much." The boy's voice broke on the last words, and tears started sliding down his cheeks. He was clearly trying very hard not to cry. Wrench pulled Mason into a hug without thinking about it, this small kid who was carrying grief that was too big for his small frame, and felt the boy's arms wrap around his neck with the kind of desperate grip that said he'd been waiting a very long time for someone to let him fall apart. Behind Wrench, the other members were moving, gathering closer, their faces showing the same mixture of shock and grief and recognition. Sticks, the club's sergeant-at-arms, pulled out his phone and pulled up a photo, the club's memorial wall where they kept pictures of fallen brothers. He turned the screen toward Mason. "Is this your grandpa?" Mason pulled back from Wrench's hug and looked at the photo, and his face transformed with recognition and relief. "That's him. That's Grandpa. He had that same jacket and those same patches. And he used to let me sit on his motorcycle in the driveway and pretend to ride, and he taught me how to check the oil. And he said when I turned 12, he was going to start teaching me everything about bikes so I could ride with him someday." The boy was talking faster now, words tumbling out like a dam had broken. He said the club was his family, and that brotherhood meant forever, and that the patches on his vest meant something important, and he wanted me to understand that before I got older. He said he was proud to be Ironside, and that I should be proud to be his grandson. But then he died, and Mom won't talk about him, and my stepdad says he was just a biker and didn't matter, and they took away all his pictures from the house, and his motorcycle got sold, and the only thing I have left is his helmet that I took from the garage before they could get rid of it. Wrench felt something crack open in his chest. This kid had been told his grandfather didn't matter, had been told to move on and forget, had been stripped of photographs and memories and connection to a man who'd clearly loved him deeply. And he'd taken the helmet as the only piece of his grandfather he could save, had carried it around like a lifeline, had finally worked up the courage to walk into a clubhouse full of strangers because he was desperate for someone to remember the man everyone was telling him to forget. "Mason, your grandfather mattered." Wrench's voice was rough with emotion. Ironside was one of the best men I ever knew. He was road captain of this club for 31 years. He taught half the guys in this room how to ride. He was the first person everyone called when they needed help, and the last person to leave when there was work to be done. He talked about you all the time, told everyone who'd listen about his grandson, who loved motorcycles, and who he was going to teach to ride someday. You were so important to him. "Really?" Mason's voice was barely a whisper. "He talked about me?" "All the time, kid." Sticks had moved closer, his phone still in his hand showing photo after photo from the memorial wall. He had pictures of you in his wallet, showed them to everyone, said you were the smartest kid he knew, and that you were going to be a great rider someday because you had the instinct for it. He was so proud of you. Other members were gathering around now, introducing themselves, telling Mason stories about Ironside. Bull, the club president, a massive man with gray threading through his dark beard, knelt down and looked Mason in the eyes. "Your grandfather saved my life once. We were riding in a storm, and I hit a patch of ice and went down. Ironside stopped, got me and my bike off the road, stayed with me until help came, even though the weather was getting worse. That's who he was, the kind of man who showed up when people needed him, Riggs, one of the younger members, told Mason about how Ironside had taught him to rebuild an engine when he was first prospecting for the club, how patient he'd been explaining every step, how he'd never made Riggs feel stupid for not knowing things. Chain, the club's treasurer, told about the time Ironside had ridden 200 miles in the middle of the night to help him when his bike broke down on a solo trip. Story after story, each one adding another piece to the picture of who Robert Ironside Reed had been, each one proving to this small boy that his grandfather had mattered, that he'd been loved and respected and remembered. Mason listened to every word with an intensity that was almost painful to witness, his hands still gripping the helmet, his face showing desperate hunger for these stories, for this proof that his grandfather had existed and had been important and deserved to be remembered. When the stories finally paused, Mason looked around at all these bikers and asked in a small voice the question that had clearly been eating at him for 6 months. Why didn't you come find me after he died? Why didn't anyone tell me these stories before? The pain on Bull's face was visible. We tried, kid. We tried to find you and your mom. Your great aunt told us your mom didn't want anything to do with the club, that she'd cut off contact with your grandpa years ago over family stuff and didn't want us reaching out. We sent letters and made phone calls, but never got any response. We thought maybe your mom was dealing with grief her own way and didn't want our help. If we'd known you needed us, if we'd known you were asking about your grandpa and not getting answers, we would have been there. We would have come for you. Mason's face showed understanding beyond his years. Mom was mad at Grandpa for a long time. I don't really understand why. Something about him choosing the club over family when she was little. But he wasn't like that with me. When he visited, he was the best. He listened to everything I said and played with me and taught me things and made me feel important. And then he died, and Mom said we weren't going to the funeral. Because she didn't want me around his biker friends, and she said I needed to forget about that part of his life. But I don't want to forget. He was my grandpa, and he was good to me. And I don't understand why everyone wants to pretend he wasn't real. The boy was crying again, and Wrench pulled him back into another hug while Bull stood up and walked to the far end of the clubhouse, where he pulled out his phone and made a call that the other members couldn't hear but could guess the content of. Child Protective Services wouldn't be involved. A kid being told to forget a dead grandparent wasn't abuse. But the club needed to figure out how to be present in Mason's life in a way that his mother wouldn't block, needed to find a path forward that honored both the boy's grief and the complicated family dynamics at play. When Bull came back, his face was set with determination. Mason, I just talked to my wife, who's a family therapist. She's going to help us figure out how to talk to your mom, how to explain that you need space to grieve your grandpa, and that the club wants to be part of helping you do that. We're not trying to cause problems with your family, but we're also not going to let you go through this alone. Your grandpa was our brother, and that makes you family too. You understand? Mason nodded, his face pressed against Wrench's shoulder. Bull continued. In the meantime, I want you to know some things. Your grandfather's patches, his vest, we have it here at the clubhouse. After he died, we cleaned it and hung it up with honor because that's what you do for fallen brothers. Would you like to see it? The boy's head shot up, his eyes wide. You have his vest? Can I really see it? They led Mason to the back wall of the clubhouse where a shadow box hung, protected behind glass, containing Robert Ironside Reed's colors. The leather vest with its Iron Ridge MC patches, the road captain rocker, the various pins and honors he'd earned over 3 decades of riding. Beneath the shadow box was a brass plate with his name, his road name, his years of service. Mason stared at it with reverence, his hands pressed against the glass. He looks just like in the photos I remember. Mason's voice was barely audible. Mom took down all the pictures at home, but I remember what his vest looked like. I remember sitting on his lap and touching the patches and asking him what they all meant. He said the big one on the back was his club, his family, and the smaller ones were places he'd ridden and things he'd done, and people he'd helped. He said earning patches meant you lived with honor and showed up for your brothers and kept your promises. Bull placed a hand on Mason's shoulder. Your grandfather lived all of that, kid, every single day. He was Ironside because he was tough, but also because he held the club together, kept us steady when things got rough. A lot of the men in this room are better people because of him. And you know what he said about you the last time I talked to him, maybe 2 weeks before he died? Mason shook his head, unable to speak. He said you were going to be something special. Said you had a good heart and a sharp mind, and that he was going to make sure you grew up knowing that being a man meant taking care of people, standing by your word, and showing up when someone needed you. He said teaching you about motorcycles was just the excuse to teach you about life, and he was looking forward to every minute of it. Bull's voice was rough. He didn't get that time with you, Mason, and that's a tragedy. But we're here now and we're not going anywhere. If you want to learn what your grandpa wanted to teach you, if you want to hear stories about him and understand what the club meant to him, we're going to make sure that happens. Over the next hour, Mason sat at one of the clubhouse's long tables, surrounded by bikers who told him story after story about Ironside. They pulled out photo albums, showed him pictures from rides and events and charity functions. They explained what each patch on his grandfather's vest meant, the history behind the club, the values they stood for. They told him about the toy runs Ironside had organized every Christmas, riding to deliver presents to kids in hospitals and shelters. They told him about the veteran support work the club did, how Ironside had been a Marine and had made sure other veterans knew they had brothers who understood what they'd been through. Wrench showed Mason a photograph of Ironside standing next to his Harley, a 1985 Electra Glide that he'd rebuilt from the frame up, the bike he'd ridden for 20 years before his death. That was his pride and joy. He spent more hours working on that bike than anyone I've ever known. Every bolt was exactly where it should be. Every part maintained perfectly. He used to say that taking care of your bike was like taking care of your life, that if you respected it and gave it attention and fixed problems before they became disasters, it would carry you anywhere you needed to go. What happened to his bike? Mason asked quietly. Mom said it got sold, but she wouldn't tell me who bought it or where it went. The room went quiet again, and several members exchanged glances. Finally, Bull spoke. The club bought it. When your mom put it up for sale, we couldn't stand the thought of Ironside's bike going to some stranger who wouldn't understand what it meant. So we pooled money and bought it, and it's in storage right now because we're fixing it up, getting it back to exactly how your grandpa kept it. We were going to keep it as a memorial, ride it in his honor at club events. Bull paused, looking at Mason with sudden intention. But maybe that's not the right plan. Maybe the right plan is we keep that bike safe for you until you're old enough to ride it. Maybe the right plan is we make sure that when you turn 16 and you're ready to learn, your grandfather's Harley is waiting for you, and we teach you on his bike the way he would have wanted to. Mason's eyes went wide with disbelief. You'd do that? You'd keep his bike for me? Kid, you're Ironside's grandson. That bike is your inheritance, your legacy. Of course we're keeping it for you. And in the meantime, if your mom agrees, we'd like you to come around the clubhouse, hang out with us, learn about bikes, hear stories about your grandpa. You don't have to wait until you're 16 to be part of this. You can start now. But what about Mom? She doesn't want me around bikers. She thinks you're dangerous or bad influences or something. Styx, who'd been quiet for a while, spoke up. His voice was measured and calm. Your mom lost her father, and she's got complicated feelings about that. From what Ironside told us, there was hurt between them that never got fully healed before he died. Sometimes when people are grieving and angry at the same time, they push away everything that reminds them of what they lost. That's not your fault, and it's not your grandfather's fault. It's just grief being messy the way grief always is. He leaned forward, making sure Mason was paying attention. But here's what I know about grief, kid. You can't move on by forgetting. You can't heal by pretending someone didn't exist. The only way through grief is to remember with honor, to keep the good parts alive while accepting that the person is gone. Your grandfather deserves to be remembered, and you deserve to grieve him. The club is going to help make sure that happens in a way that doesn't hurt your relationship with your mom. Bull's wife, Karen, arrived at the clubhouse about 45 minutes after Mason had first walked in. She was a family therapist who specialized in grief counseling, and she sat down with Mason and talked to him gently about what he'd been experiencing, about the isolation of not being allowed to talk about someone he loved, about the importance of finding healthy ways to remember and honor his grandfather. Then she asked for Mason's mother's phone number and, with Mason's permission, called her to arrange a meeting. The conversation that followed was tense initially. Mason's mother, Jennifer Reed, arrived at the clubhouse 30 minutes later, her face set with defensive anger that barely concealed the fear and grief underneath. She walked in ready for a fight, ready to protect her son from what she perceived as negative influences, ready to argue that her father's lifestyle had been selfish and that Mason didn't need to be exposed to it. But what she found instead was her son sitting at a table surrounded by bikers who were showing him photographs and telling him stories that made him laugh and cry and feel connected to a grandfather he'd been told to forget. She saw grown men treating her son with gentleness and respect, saw them explaining her father's legacy in terms of service and honor and community. And she saw Mason's face, lit up with a joy and peace she hadn't seen since her father's death 6 months ago. Karen Morrison, Wrench's wife who'd arrived with Bull's wife to provide support, approached Jennifer carefully. "Ms. Reed, I'm Karen. I'm a family therapist, and I'm also Wrench's wife. I want you to know that nobody here is trying to undermine your parenting or cause problems. But your son is grieving, and he needs space to do that in a healthy way. The club wants to support him in honoring his grandfather's memory while respecting your family boundaries." Jennifer's defensive posture cracked slightly. "You don't understand. My father chose this club over his family for years. When I was growing up, he was always riding, always at the clubhouse, always putting his brothers before his daughter. I grew up feeling like I didn't matter as much as his motorcycle and his club. When he died, I couldn't handle seeing all these men at his funeral, couldn't handle them talking about how great he was when I remembered all the times he wasn't there for me." Bull, who'd been standing back to give Jennifer and Karen space, stepped forward carefully. "Ms. Reed, Ironside, talked about that regret constantly. He told me and every other member here that he'd failed you as a father when you were young, that he'd prioritized the club over being present for his family, that it was his biggest regret. He said he was trying to make it right with Mason, trying to be the grandfather he hadn't been as a father. He didn't excuse what he'd done wrong, didn't pretend it hadn't hurt you. He just hoped he could do better the second time around." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "He told you that? He told everyone that." Bull's voice was gentle. "Your father wasn't perfect, none of us are, but he learned from his mistakes, and he loved Mason with everything he had, and Mason loved him back. Your son deserves to grieve that loss and to remember the good parts of his grandfather, even while understanding that your relationship with your father was complicated." Over the next hour, Karen facilitated a conversation between Jennifer and the club members that allowed everyone to express their perspectives and find common ground. Jennifer agreed that Mason could visit the clubhouse twice a month, supervised visits where he could spend time with men who'd known his grandfather and could hear stories and learn about motorcycles in an age-appropriate way. The club agreed to respect Jennifer's boundaries and to support her in her own grief journey, even if that meant giving her space when she needed it. Before Mason left that day, Bull presented him with something that made the boy's eyes go wide. "We want you to have this. It's not your grandfather's vest that stays in the memorial case, but it's something that belongs to you." He handed Mason a small leather vest, youth-sized, with a single patch on the back that read Iron Ridge MC Legacy, with a smaller patch underneath that said, "Property of Ironside. Your grandfather was having this made for you. He ordered it about a month before he died. It came in after the funeral, and we've been keeping it safe, hoping we'd find you someday. It's not a full member's vest, and you're not a member because you're 9 years old. But it marks you as family, as someone the club protects and honors. You wear this when you visit, and everyone knows you're Ironside's grandson, and that means something here." Mason put on the vest with trembling hands, and it fit perfectly, sized for a 9-year-old boy who'd grow into it over the next few years. He looked at his mother with desperate hope. "Can I wear it?" Jennifer's face showed the complex emotions of a woman whose grief and anger were slowly giving way to acceptance. "Yes, you can wear it." She looked at Bull. "Thank you for this. Thank you for seeing what my son needed even when I couldn't." Over the months that followed, Mason became a regular presence at Iron Ridge MC events. He came to the clubhouse twice a month, where various members taught him basic motorcycle maintenance, showed him how to change oil and check tire pressure and understand engine mechanics. They taught him the club's values, about showing up for brothers, about keeping your word, about using strength to protect rather than intimidate. They told him endless stories about Ironside, keeping his grandfather's memory alive in ways that were healthy and honoring rather than dwelling in grief. On the 6-month anniversary of that first visit, Iron Ridge MC organized a memorial ride for Ironside. Over 200 bikers showed up, members from clubs across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, all there to honor a fallen brother and to show support for his grandson. Mason rode on the back of Bull's bike, wearing his legacy vest and the helmet that had once been his grandfather's, properly fitted now with new padding. They rode to the cemetery where Robert Ironside Reed was buried, and they held a brief ceremony where Mason placed flowers on his grandfather's grave and read a letter he'd written about what his grandfather meant to him and how the club had helped him grieve in healthy ways. Jennifer attended that memorial ride and she cried through the whole thing, but they were healing tears, the kind that come when grief is finally allowed to move through you instead of being trapped inside. After the ceremony, she approached Bull and thanked him with a sincerity that showed how much the club's intervention had meant not just to Mason, but to her as well. When Mason turned 12, 3 years after that first visit to the clubhouse, Iron Ridge MC threw him a birthday party that drew 50 members and their families. They presented him with his grandfather's Harley, fully restored to showroom condition, registered in a trust that would transfer to Mason when he turned 18 and got his motorcycle license. Until then, the bike would stay at the clubhouse where Mason could visit it, sit on it, learn on it, and eventually, when he was old enough, start it up and take short supervised rides in the clubhouse parking lot under the watchful eyes of men who'd promised his grandfather they'd teach his grandson everything Ironside hadn't gotten the chance to teach himself. Mason stood beside that Harley with tears streaming down his face and said something that every person present remembered forever. My grandpa's helmet was on the hook at home, and I thought that meant he was gone and wasn't coming back. But now I know that helmets stay on hooks because riders always come back. And even though Grandpa can't come back, his legacy does. His bike is here, his brothers are here, his values are here. And as long as I remember him and live the way he taught me to live, he's still riding with me. That's what brotherhood means. That's what forever means. Bull looked at this 12-year-old boy who'd walked into their clubhouse 3 years ago carrying his dead grandfather's helmet and desperate for someone to remember, who'd grown into a confident young man who understood honor and legacy and the importance of chosen family. Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Mason. Not just because you're going to ride his bike someday, but because you're becoming the kind of man he hoped you'd be. A man who remembers what matters, who honors his people, who shows up when someone needs him. Jennifer Reed, standing beside her son, placed a hand on his shoulder and added something that meant more to the assembled bikers than she probably realized. Thank you all for giving my son something I couldn't give him by myself. Thank you for letting him grieve and remember and belong. My father made mistakes with me, but he was trying to do better with Mason, and you've all helped finish what he started. That means everything. The story of Mason and the helmet spread through motorcycle communities across the region, becoming a reminder about the importance of letting children grieve in their own ways and in their own time, about the value of chosen family and brotherhood that extends beyond death, about the reality that complicated family histories don't negate the legitimate grief of children who lose people they love. Iron Ridge MC made supporting Mason part of their core identity, and over the years they extended that same support to other kids who'd lost parents or grandparents who'd been club members, creating a legacy program that ensured no child would ever have to grieve alone or in silence the way Mason almost had. Mason still visits that clubhouse regularly, now 16, and learning to ride under Bull's patient instruction on his grandfather's Harley. He's become a bridge between his mother and the club, helping Jennifer slowly heal her own complicated grief about her father, while maintaining boundaries that keep everyone safe and respected. He talks about prospecting for Iron Ridge when he turns 18, about earning his patches the way his grandfather did, about living up to the legacy that was almost lost, but was saved by his own courage in walking through that clubhouse door with a helmet clutched in his hands and a desperate need to be heard. The helmet itself, the one Mason carried that day, now hangs in the Iron Ridge clubhouse beside his grandfather's memorial shadow box, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is refuse to forget someone they love. And sometimes the most important thing adults can do is create space for that remembering to happen with honor and dignity and truth. Because grief doesn't have a timeline and children don't need to move on from the people they've lost, they need support in carrying those people forward in ways that honor both the loss and the love that remains.